Today we're going to do something a little bit different, and we're going to paint on an oval. I'm not really pointing to it. On an oval canvas. I found this at Michael's, but you can also find them on Amazon and different places, and it's just such an interesting way to paint because it changes the composition entirely. Generally, we're trying to wrap all of these subjects around our painting, leading them in, and this one, it makes it easy because everything just follows this round edge. So you can really get lost in the painting, which is it's something I think we all aim to do with all of our paintings, and it makes it so easy. Anyways, I do want to get into the actual painting lesson. So as always, if you'd like help with the drawing process, there is a link in the description where you can find the digital sketch. Also, you can find the full hour-long version over on Patreon, along with 40 other hour-long lessons, reference photos, and all of that fun stuff. So if you're interested, go check it out. But with that said, let's jump into today's hour-long cut-up lesson thing. So I'm starting here with a medium-sized round-headed brush, and generally we start with a larger square-headed brush because we want to cover a lot of surface area and we want to work sharply around our subjects in the foreground. Today, however, I used the medium-sized round-headed brush because I wanted a very soft application and aesthetic. The round-headed brushes have a fairly feathered edge, so you generally get a dense pigment in the middle of your stroke, and then to all the sides it begins to dissipate and you get something that becomes more transparent. So you get a very soft look with it. And I wanted the sky in this piece to be very relaxing, very soft. I wanted it to show brush strokes to make it a little bit more dynamic than we normally do. And I thought the best way to do so would be with this brush. Now, for the first application, I ensured that my brush was damp so that I could extend the wet life of my paint and so that I could drag the paint out a little bit farther than I'd be able to do normally. Now, from there, I grabbed equal parts titanium white and primary blue. I applied that all the way around my moon with a bit of a tapping motion. Again, I wanted to instigate a little bit of movement in the sky. I thought it would add an extra layer of interest to the painting, and that round shape of the brush stroke also complements the round canvas very well. From there, I got a little bit of additional primary blue. I added that into my initial mixture, and I applied that around the initial application with that same application blending the two together. Then I added a little bit of Mars Black to the mixture, added that around, and I just continued to build out the edges of the light and the glow that is coming here from the moon. So it's a process of slowly making the pigment slightly darker as we move farther and farther away from the moon itself. Then I'm switching over to my smaller round-headed brush. I'm grabbing some titanium white paint and I'm really watering it down here. Then I'm going to put my palette down fairly carefully, hopefully to the point where it doesn't knock just about everything over. I'm going to peel back the bristles and I'm going to launch some paint at the canvas, rendering stars. This is a technique I love to use in the 10-minute painting lessons because it's just so quick and efficient. With this little bit of a tip back with the bristles and the launch, we are able to render hundreds of little stars so quickly. And what's best about them is that they're all different and changing. Then I'm going to take that same brush and I'm going to work around the edges of my moon. Now I'm going to go back to the moon a good number of times, so this doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but right now I'm just working on the edge and trying to get it as soft and round as possible. As you can see, it blends really nicely out into the blue that we have, and then with a slight, very small tapping effect, I'm incorporating some texture in the moon. I'm leaving slight openings of gray and slight blends. That way it looks like the moon is full of craters and has a little bit more character than just being a pure, stark white. Now here, I am going down to the mist, and I'm going to start drawing that in with the medium-sized round-headed brush. So I'm using a bit of a rounded stroke as well. That way we get some volume and we get those nice soft edges as well. Here I'm getting it to go into the back of the painting. I'm allowed to dissipate slightly as we get farther and farther away from the moon, as it's not going to have as much light reflected on it. And I'm also allowing it to dissipate and run out on my brush as I move upwards from the initial application. This is going to make it look slightly more transparent, and it's going to give it a little bit more of an ethereal effect as we move upwards and as it blends into the black. So here, as you can see, I'm grabbing some additional blue, and I'm just going to add some additional glow to the moon, as we've talked about. Through this process, yes, we will lose some stars, but we're just slowly editing it until we get exactly what we want, and of course we can go back in and add in more stars. It is certainly not too late. We are applying this new pigment in the same way that we did before, and you can see that this application, while a similar value and brightness on the palette to what we had before, it is much more bright on the canvas now because we are building it on top of a bright blue layer instead of a black layer. Now I'm going to be taking the medium-sized square-headed brush. Here I'm taking some titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, and I do mean just a little bit because the Mars black is a very strong pigment and it quickly overwhelms all of our other pigments. Here I'm just creating a fairly bright gray, as you can see, in relation to everything else, and I'm going to use this as the base pigment for my mountains. So I'm using the square-headed brush because of course it can hold a good amount of paint, and because it does have a very sharp edge, which is fantastic for subjects with sharp edges like mountains. Not so much clouds, but here with mountains with trees, it's great. So I'm starting on the very edge, and then I'm working my way down, as you can see. I'm leaving slight openings in the mountain, so there are darker areas, again areas that are not going to be getting as much light, perhaps little divots or pathways in the mountain. So now I'm going to start working on some highlights to it and building that detail. I'm starting at the very top of the mountain with a much brighter gray or even pure titanium white, and I'm just slowly moving downwards, as you can see. I'm going to leave openings just like I did with the gray, and I'm going to ensure that the highlight looks as natural as I can make it moving down the mountain here. So I'm using a bit of a tapping effect, that way we get a bit more texture and a bit more detail. You could use a pure stroke, but you won't get as many little impressions through that, and I do want this to look fairly interesting. Here you can see that we apply it to the top and it naturally dissipates as we move downwards. That's because we're actually running out of pigment on our brush, so when we apply it we get a much more transparent application because the brush is damp, and we don't get as stark of an application. Here I'm mixing up a bit of a green. As you can see, it's a very dark green, it's a very desaturated green. When you mix primary yellow with Mars black, instead of getting a very bright, light, cool green, we're going to get a much warmer, richer green, and I think that can be really nice for base layers. So anyway, I mixed that pigment initially with the square-headed brush, and now I'm switching over to the older square-headed brush. So with this tapping motion, I'm just layering on some of these trees to the base here of the mountains and ensuring that we get something nice and interesting. It looks like there is life in the painting, and this greenery in the back of the painting will look very cohesive because we have greenery in the foreground of the painting as well, and it'll just look like it continues to roll down through and then up into the mountains. So there, I'm just doing a bit of that tapping effect. I'm grabbing a little bit more of my Mars black, a little bit more of that primary yellow, and I'm slowly adding to this through that tapping motion. Now I'm going over to the mid/foreground, and I'm using a very desaturated green with the medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm using a lot of primary yellow here. I'm using a bit of primary blue. As we get closer and closer to us, it'll make it look much more fresh and saturated, but I'm also going to use some Mars black to darken it as well. Now here, I'm switching over to the smaller square-headed brush. I'm grabbing some primary red and some titanium white. I'm mixing up a nice little pink here, and with this I'm going to start to draw on some moonlit flowers. With each little application, I'm going to try to do an individual petal. These flowers are fairly close to us, so for the most part that should work. As we get a little bit farther away, we might make each application of the brush a flower itself. As things get farther and farther in the distance, they do lose the detail. Our eyes cannot recognize all of the little intricacies of it, and your painting will look much more realistic if you allow that detail to slowly be lost as you get farther and farther in the back of the painting. Here you can see that I'm grabbing a bit of primary red, I'm grabbing some titanium white, and I'm going to that edge, and with a little bit of a tapping motion, I'm creating the detail that these flowers are going to have on the highlights. I'm going to try to get the value fairly similar to that of the other flowers in the painting, just because with that it's going to look much more cohesive and it'll look much more interesting. Now we're going to switch back over to the older square-headed brush. Remember, you can make one of these very easily by just peeling back the bristles on a square-headed brush, applying a little bit of pressure, and now with this we can dab it onto the canvas and make so many implications. We're using this for the foliage here. We're using a lot of greens, very similar to what we used down in the grass. That way it's cohesive. The application is very cohesive with the trees that we have in the background. So everything's kind of blending together in the way that we need it to be. I'm applying the initial greens to the edges of the trees that are closest to the moon. Then I'm tapping backwards, creating a bit of a gradient and a blend, but again, not a soft gradient, not a soft blend, not in the traditional sense of moving the brush with a stroke. Instead, we're doing it with a tapping motion. Now here I've added an additional highlight, and I'm slowly building that up. Remember, it's about creating the highlights, the midtones, the dark tones, and everything in between. We're slowly getting to a green that is fairly similar to that of the grass down below, and I'm allowing the majority of the greens to be around the moon, just because, while it's kind of a surreal effect in the painting, it's closer to the moon. While it wouldn't actually be in real life, it would look a little bit more highlighted here, and it just brings the eye to that area. Now here I'm adding the highlights to the edges of the trees. It's a burnt umber, it's a nice titanium white. I'm doing a bit of a tapping motion rather than a application and a drag, because it's going to give me a little bit of a texture, which is nice because it shows that the tree actually has some bark on it, and that bark is going to create little shadows and divots in between, much like the mountain and most everything else in the painting. It's just going to create an extra layer of depth within that subject. Now I'm going back to my palette. I'm still using that smaller round-headed brush, taking some titanium white, some Mars black, some of our primary blue, and I'm going to go back up into the sky and start to draw on some clouds. Now I didn't have these clouds drawn on like this in the initial sketch that I did on the painting, but I did include them in the digital sketch, which I've included over on Patreon as well. So with this, you are able to do the little round effects of clouds. We're going to make these very soft. We are going to make them fairly subdued initially. We're picking a color that is fairly close to the initial dark color that's on the canvas, but we're going to make it a little bit brighter, and then we're going to add highlights to the top. But I'm going to do a lot of it with this little circular motion with the brush, that way they look nice and soft. And this is going to make the piece again have a little bit more movement and a little bit more dynamic, because it's going to imply that these clouds are rolling through the valley, through the sky, and it's just going to add this additional level of interest to it. Hey there, it's Ryan O'Rourke. I truly hope you enjoyed today's little extra video. It was essentially a cut-up version of one of the many hour-long lessons which we offer over on patreon.com. Over there you'll also find digital sketches of the 10-minute painting lessons, digital sketches of these hour-long painting lessons, and a bunch of reference photos as well. So if any of that interests you, or if you just want to support the channel, go over there and check it out. It is a pleasure to make these long form videos, and I love to share them with all of you. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next Saturday with a new video, and above all, as always, stay creative.